Hello friend, welcome back to my channel. How are you today? I hope you're doing well. It's Tim here, and in this video, I'll be guiding you through the steps to create this holiday-inspired landscape painting. So every year at Christmas, we have a tradition of going to see local Christmas light displays, and it's something I look forward to every year, so I wanted to create a painting inspired by them. So if you recreate this painting and are on Instagram, I would absolutely love to see it, so please tag me at Timstar Studio. Upcoming here are the hex codes for the palette of colors that you'll need to be able to paint along with me. It's a small list of colors today, as well as the brushes, which are in the default library except for the damp brush, but I do have a video up on my channel on how to recreate that brush from scratch, so if you need it, definitely go check it out. So the first step of our tutorial is to take a screenshot of the trace outline layer and insert it into a square sized canvas, and then trace over it into a blank layer so you have a guide for your painting. Please feel free to take any breaks that you might need along the way, and when you're ready, let's begin. Alright, so to get into our tutorial, let's turn our trace layer down to around 10% opacity. Let's add a new layer and put it below the trace layer. Now using the second color in the first row, let's fill in the entire canvas. Let's add a new layer. Now using the soft airbrush, let's do full size and full opacity. Using the first color in the first row, let's place a stripe of color at the top of the canvas, just like this. Now using the third color in the first row, let's place a stripe of color roughly in the center of the painting. Now using Gaussian blur, let's blur this layer to about 50%. Let's add a new layer. Still using the soft airbrush, let's put this layer into soft light. Using the first color in the second row, I'm going to place another stripe of color, just like this, up at the top of the canvas. Then using Gaussian blur, let's blur this layer to about 53%. Now let's paint the stars. Let's add a new layer. Let's switch over to using the paintbrush now with the technical pen. And let's use about 50% brush size and full opacity. Now using the fourth color in the second row, and we're going to place some darker background stars across the entire sky area, just like this. Placing as little or as many as you'd like. And then using the fifth color in the second row, we're going to place some highlight star dots on top, just like this. When you're happy with your stars, let's make a duplicate layer of them. Now on this duplicate layer, let's use Gaussian blur and blur this layer to about 29%. Let's make another duplicate of the original star layer. And then using Gaussian blur again, let's blur that layer to about 11%. Then let's collapse our star layers back together. Now let's add a new layer. Let's switch over to the soft airbrush. And I'm gonna go down to like 8% brush size, and let's use the fifth color in the first row. And I think here I wanna make the trace outline layer just a little bit brighter. That way we can see it a little bit better. And it actually might help because the colors are dark. Let's use hue and saturation and up the brightness level. That way we can see the trace outline just a little bit better. So back to this new layer, using the soft airbrush, 8% brush size. So using the fifth color in the first row, let's follow this little line of scribbles. And they don't need to be perfect. We just need some highs and lows. Just like this. Now using Gaussian blur, let's blur this layer to about 15%. Let's switch over to using the blending tool now with the damp brush. And let's use about 9% brush size and around 41% opacity or so. And using up and down zigzag paint strokes, let's lightly buff and blend out this new Aurora color, making sure to blend above and below to make sure we get some peaks and valleys. We're not completely blending away this color into the background, we're really just softening it up and adding a little bit of texture to it. And now we're going to turn the opacity of this layer down to around 71%. And now let's create a duplicate of the Aurora layer. And let's put this new layer now into color dodge. And I'm going to actually turn the opacity of this layer down just a little bit more to around 58%. I thought it was still just a little too bright. Now let's turn the trace layer off for just a moment. All right, so using hue and saturation, let's up the saturation. And I'm actually going to turn this layer's opacity down just a little bit more. Perfect. About 26%. Now let's merge all of our layers together, which brings us to painting our background trees. Let's add a new layer. I'm going to switch over to the soft airbrush. Using full size and full opacity, let's use the first color in the second row, and let's paint a stripe of color in the center of the painting, just like this. Doesn't need to be perfect. Now let's fill in the bottom half of this. Get rid of that little line there. Now using Gaussian blur again, let's blur this layer to about 36%. Now let's add a new layer. And let's switch over to using the water pen now with the paintbrush, using about 10% brush size with full opacity. And in this section, we'll be using up and down zigzag cross-hatching-ish paint strokes with varying heights to create the illusion of shorter and taller trees. And then we'll be using the same paint strokes to blend them out with using the blending tool, and then you'll see me doubling it to make them more opaque. Using up and down zigzag paint strokes, we're going to start painting our trees, and we're going to follow the second line just like this. Just making sure we include some higher strokes and some lower strokes to give the illusion of some smaller trees and taller trees. When we reach the edge, I'm going to make my brush size just a little bit bigger. We're going to fill in this line up here. And now I'm going to shrink my brush size down to around 16%. Let's use the second color in the second row now, and using the same paint strokes, we're going to add some color on the top edge line of the trees, just like this down the row. When this color is added, let's switch over to the blending tool now with the water pen, using about 8% brush size with full opacity, and we're going to start blending them out, using the same paint strokes to blend them out with. Making sure to vary between shorter and longer paint strokes to give the illusion of shorter and taller trees, just like this. And when we reach the end of the line, we're going to repeat this. And now I'm going to grab some of this darker color, and we're going to start grabbing and blending into the middle green. And then here at the bottom, I'm just going to grab and just lightly blend that line out just a little bit, just like that. When we reach the end, I'm going to zoom back, which brings us to painting the ground and the snow. I'm going to add a new layer. Let's switch over to using the damp brush now. And let's use about 10% brush size and about 85% opacity. Let's use the fourth color in the second row. Now starting at this line here, we're going to use long sweeping paint strokes back and forth from edge to edge to fill in the snow line. And the damp brush is set to trail off, so the longer you hold it down, the color will slowly start to fade away, which will create a really nice gradient effect and make it a lot easier to paint shadows with. Let's turn the opacity of this layer down just a little bit. Let's turn it down to like 67%. Let's add a new layer. And let's switch to about 6% brush size and about 76% or so in opacity. And using the same paint strokes, we're going to add some highlights to the grass. And because we turned the opacity of that original layer down, it's going to create the illusion of some shadow underneath. You don't want to completely get rid of the undercolor. Let's add a new layer. Now using the fifth color in the second row, we're going to use the same sweeping paint strokes, only we're going to focus them mostly under the tree area now. Just like this. Just kind of letting the color trail off towards the bottom. Now let's merge these snow layers together. Let's switch over to the blending tool now with the damp brush. Let's use about 10% brush size and about 49% or so in opacity. And we're going to use the same paint strokes to lightly blend them out. And we're just kind of softening the color up. We're not completely blending it away. Let's add a new layer and put it into overlay. Let's switch over now to using the soft airbrush. Let's use about 65% or so size and full opacity. Now using the 6th color in the first row. Now in the center of the painting, we're going to add some highlight, just like this right here. Now using Gaussian blur, let's blur this layer to about 42%. Let's switch over to using the blending tool now with the damp brush, about 7% brush size and 49% opacity. And let's use those same paint strokes and lightly blend these highlights in. Let's add another new layer. Let's put it into overlay. Using the same color, switching back over to the paintbrush with the soft airbrush. Let's put a thinner strip of highlight color right in the center, right underneath of the tree, just like that. And then repeating the same step as before, let's use Gaussian blur and blur this layer to about 39%. Let's switch over to the blending tool now with the same settings, and then just very lightly blend this area out. And when you're happy with your blending, let's merge all of our layers back together except for the trace layer, just like this. Now let's switch over to the blending tool now. Let's go to about 10% brush size and 44% or so in opacity. And right on the right side of the tree, and using circular scrubbing paint strokes, we're going to drag the snow color over the bottom edge of the tree line to create the impression of some snow-covered bushes. Just like that. And then I'm going to soften the bottom up here. And then I'm going to repeat that on the left-hand side, just using circular directional paint strokes to create the impression of some bushes. And then just lightly soften the edge out there. And don't worry about them being too perfect, they're just barely visible in the background. And when you're happy with your blending and your bushes, let's add a new layer. And now we're going to paint the main pine tree. Alright, so to make this a little bit easier, I'm actually going to add a new layer. And I'm going to put this purple color down to fill the entire screen so that way it's easier to see. And I also wanted to mention, I do actually have an additional video up on my channel that goes a little bit more in depth on how to create easy detailed pine trees. So if you'd like to know more on how to paint them, definitely go check that out. Now let's add a new layer, and let's switch over to using the paintbrush now with the water pen, about 10% brush size and full opacity. And using the first color in the second row, and let's paint a straight line down the center of the tree outline. Now starting on the left side, we're actually going to use these kind of paint strokes all the way down. They're kind of curved outwards just a little bit, and I wanted to do that just so it's easier to see. And we're going to follow the shape of the trace outline. Here on the edges, I am curving them outwards just a little bit, kind of flicking them out, and then just filling them in. And we're going to repeat the same step down the entire left side of the tree, progressively getting wider with the outline as we work towards the bottom. Now let's repeat these same steps for the right side of the tree now. And once you have your tree filled in, I'm actually going to flip my canvas here real quick to check for balance. This is a really great way to make sure your tree looks similar on both sides. And we're not looking for complete symmetry here. We just want to make sure the shape isn't sticking out too bad on either side. Okay, once you get your shape, I'm actually going to take Liquify real quick. And we're going to move our shape inwards just a little bit. This is a really easy, quick way to adjust our tree without making too big a change to it. Now still using the water pen, I'm going to make my brush size just a little bit smaller, around 8% size or so. And now using the second color in the second row, and I'm going to turn the trace outline layer off for just a moment. And now using the same similar paint strokes that we used before, we're going to place this new green color across the entire tree now with short little flicks just like this, following the shape of the tree as we go down, still allowing some of the dark undercolor still to show through. We just want to add a little bit of color texture to blend with in a moment. Now I'm going to make my brush size just a little bit smaller, closer to 6% or so. And now let's paint some snow. Now we're going to paint the snow all on the same layer. Now using the fourth color in the second row, I'm going to change my brush stroke just a little bit. So here on the top, I'm going to paint just a little straight line to extend the line of the top part of the tree. So for this, I'm actually going to paint both sides separately. So I'm going to paint the left side and then the right side. So we're going to be adding some snow to the tree, and we're going to be using a paint stroke that kind of looks like this. That's the best way I can describe it. I'm not really sure what shape that is, but when you put it on the tree, you'll see what I mean here. And we're going to place these paint strokes just along the edges of the tree, just like this, working our way down the tree, making each new row random. And I am stopping around in the center. Each one I am changing up a little bit too. We're not making both sides completely the same or each row the same. You can place them wherever you like. The more random they are, the more natural the tree will end up looking. And we're going to flip it. And I'm going to repeat the same thing, adding just a little bit here, and then kind of connecting them there in the center, just randomizing each row. Once you have the snow added, I'm going to switch over to using the blending tool now with the water pen. Let's go down to like 8% brush size with full opacity. And using the same paint strokes that we just used to paint the snow with, we're going to lightly blend out our entire tree now. And we're not completely blending all of the colors together. We're just kind of going around the edge and just lightly merging the colors and textures together. This is a really strong effect, so be super careful with it. But I'm basically using the same paint strokes that I used just to put the snow on. Just kind of varying and making each row random. That way it looks a little bit more natural. Okay, and when you get your tree blended, I'm actually going to take the purple layer away. Let's add a new layer. Now using the fifth color in the second row, and using about 5% brush size now. And now we're going to put some lighter highlight snow with using that same, I'm going to put it over here, kind of pattern. It's kind of a similar pattern that we used on the trees, only a little bit more like loopy at the bottom. That way it creates more of like a pine bough look. And if you want to switch sides and do half the tree, you're definitely more than welcome to, and then finish using it by flipping it. And here towards the bottom too, I'm kind of breaking the pattern up a little bit more, not fully connecting them here and there. That way the snow looks a little bit more random. Let's flip the canvas, and I'm going to repeat the same now on the other side. And when you're happy with your snow highlights, let's add a new layer. Still using the water pen with the paintbrush, let's go down to like 5% brush size still with full opacity, and still using the same color. And we're going to paint little W shapes sporadically and randomly in between each row, just like this, kind of in a bricklay pattern, just making sure in each row, each W is not directly underneath the last row. And then we're going to make them just a little bit bigger the further we get to the bottom. And then I'm going to turn the opacity of this layer down, about 66% or so. Now let's merge all three tree layers back together. Let's switch over to using the blending tool now, still with the water pen, using about 6% brush size and full opacity. And let's use the same paint strokes as before to blend out all of our new highlight textures back into our tree, just kind of marrying it all together. When you have your tree blended, I'm actually going to add just a couple of little detail flicks around the edge just to kind of draw it out a little bit, kind of break up that edge line, make it look less uniform. We're going to add some detail paint strokes in the middle here and there just to kind of break up the line a little bit. And when you're happy with your tree, we're going to add some lights. I also wanted to thank you so much for the support, and if you're enjoying this video so far, I invite you to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps my channel out. I'm working on so many fun new tutorials that I'm super excited to share coming soon. Let's add a new layer. Let's switch over to the paintbrush now with the technical pen. Let's switch to using the 6th color in the first row. Let's do full size and full opacity, and starting here at the bottom, let's paint some dots in the darker areas of the trees in a row, kind of staggering their placement so they don't look too perfect, just like this. And we're going to repeat the same step for the next couple rows. Kind of randomizing the number of dots too, they don't all need to be perfect or even. And when we get to about right here on the tree, I'm actually going to shrink the brush size just a little bit. Let's change it to around 80% size or so, just so they're a little bit smaller. Still randomizing the number of dots in each row. Next, I'm actually going to turn the opacity of this layer down for a moment. Let's turn it down to like 14%. That way they're still just slightly visible. Let's add a new layer. Let's switch over to using the light pen now with the paintbrush, and let's use the 6th color in the second row. Let's use full size and full opacity. Now, repeating the same steps as before, we're going to place dots in between each of the dots that we made before that are now turned down, creating a new row of lights over top of them, just like this. Really randomizing the number of dots in each row and where they're sitting at, staggering some of them closer and some further away, above and below from each other, and then we're going to repeat this across the rest of the tree. If you press a little bit lighter too towards the top, the dots will be just a little bit smaller, that way you don't have to change your size. Now, when you get to the very top, I'm going to turn the opacity of the first light layer back up, which will create this really cool lit effect for our tree. Next, let's add a new layer. Still using the light pen, we're going to place a little dot on the top of the tree to act as a little tree topper, which looks super cute. Let's add a new layer and put it into soft light. Still using the light pen with the same color, the 6th color in the second row. Let's paint a V shape along the edges of the tree, just like this. Then let's use Gaussian blur, and let's blur this layer to around 31%. Now we're going to switch over to the paintbrush now, and we're going to go to the luminance section, over to light flare. Let's add a new layer and put it into hard light. And we're going to use about 20% brush size, and we're going to place one light flare in the middle of the star on the top of the tree, just like that. Now let's use Gaussian blur and blur this layer to about 5%. And then we're going to turn the opacity of this light flare down just a little bit. Let's turn it down to around 59%, which gives us a cute little glow on the top of the tree. Which brings us to painting our final details. Now this original tree layer, let's make a duplicate copy of it. Let's turn our trace outline layer back on. Now this new copy layer we just made, we're actually going to lift it up and put it right underneath of the trace outline. And let's make another duplicate layer, so there's 2 of them. We're going to take the first one, I'm going to zoom back. We're going to put it right here. I'm going to put this in freeform, and we're going to stretch this out just a little bit, and then stretch the width, and then move it back over here. I'm going to use hue and saturation and turn the brightness down. And then let's turn the saturation down to about 36%. Now this new tree, let's move it over here. I'm going to stretch it out just a little bit and move the width over. Place it right about here. Now using hue and saturation again, let's turn the brightness down and let's turn our saturation down around 35%. Let's turn our trace outline layer off. Let's add a new layer and put that layer into soft light. Let's switch over to using the soft airbrush now. Let's use the first color in the second row, full size and full opacity, and let's place a strip of color along the left side edge, just like this, the bottom, and then the right side edge. And then using Gaussian blur, let's blur this layer to about 39%. Now we're going to turn the opacity of this layer down. Let's go to like 26%. Let's add a new layer, and we're going to repeat the same step, placing a line of color on the left side, the bottom edge, and the right side edge, just like this. And then using Gaussian blur again, we're going to blur this layer to around 24%, and we're going to turn the opacity of this layer down to around 40%. Let's add a new layer and put it into overlay. Let's use the sixth color in the first row. Let's switch over to using the damp brush now with the paintbrush, about 7% brush size, 84% opacity. And with long sweeping paint strokes, again, we're going to put just a little bit of highlight right down here underneath the tree, kind of coming into a point right in the center of the bottom of the painting. And now using the blending tool with the damp brush as well, let's use like 10% brush size, 40% opacity. Using the same paint strokes, let's lightly blend it out. Just kind of softening that edge up. And then I'm going to turn the opacity of this layer down about 68%, which brings us to painting some special effects details. Let's add a new layer. Now we're going to switch over to using the paintbrush now with the Driven Snow. And Driven Snow, I believe, is in the Elements section. Yep, right here. And we're going to switch to using about 30% size. Let's use the sixth color in the first row for now. Full opacity. And starting on the top left-hand side using diagonal paint strokes, let's lay a wash of the snow over top of our scene, just like this. Let's make a copy of the snow layer. And on the bottom of the two snow layers, let's use Gaussian blur. And we're going to blur this layer to around 8%. Now the top layer of snow, I'm actually going to take the opacity and let's turn it down. Let's turn it down to about 61% or so. Let's merge the two together. And then I'm going to turn the opacity of this layer way down. Let's turn it down to about 16%. And finally, let's add a new layer and put that layer into overlay. We're going to switch over to using the paintbrush now with the light pen. Let's still do full size and full opacity. Using the same color, let's paint another V along the edges here, just like this. Let's put a little ring of color around the top of the star. And let's put just a little bit on the underside of the tree, coming down into a little triangle shape in the center of the painting again. Now let's use Gaussian blur and blur this layer to about 30%, and let's turn the opacity of this layer down to about 30%, and we're done. Now it's time to sign our painting. I wanted to thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. I had a lot of fun painting this one, and I hope you did too. I have a ton of other tutorials now up on my channel too, so if you're still in the painting mood, definitely go check those out. If you have any ideas or thoughts of any other landscape ideas you want to see, let me know below. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, please like, comment, and subscribe. And I'm wishing you a safe and happy holiday season. And until next time, friend, happy painting.